Hi, we continue in Genesis 28 after Esau has taken wives and Jacob's parents have sent him under different names back to the old country, either to Haran, as you can see up there, or to Paddan Aram, as we heard earlier. But we hear he's going to Haran, and so this is the journey back to the old country from one perspective, or to exile from another perspective. And that's one of the major themes we're going to have to look at in this introduction. So you can see on the right side of the screen the journey starting from Beersheba up here to Haran. It's a great distance, and we'll look more closely at that in our next video. Note that it seems to take place in just a couple of verses here after Jacob's experience of what's usually called the ladder, although we'll see it's not a ladder. He just arrives there. But the point is that there's this journey to the old country, and he'll be there and trapped there under the control of his uncle Laban until he gets out. And so we need to look at this unit and understand some of the themes that are going on here, and there are many themes, before we enter into the individual passages. As I showed earlier when we began the Jacob cycle back in earlier chapters, I noted this chart here with reading times and places of the Jacob story, and that's of the whole Jacob story, noting how it's read all the way up to Roman times by Christians, and then in our time, and that's still posted on the radicalbible.net webpage, and you can read that. But I'd like to focus on is reading these four chapters, 28 to 31, in a particular way. So there's three ways of reading it, and we're going to need to read all three of those, to the exclusion of a couple of other ways I didn't list here. One is the immediate plot. So as we see, Jacob is leaving, going to Haran on his own to try to find a wife, and we can follow his adventures. But another level, as we've seen since chapter 25 with the birth oracle, where Rebecca was told there are two nations in your womb, we're going to focus on the fact that after this section, in the return to Esau section that we looked at as part of the overall chiasm, Jacob will have an experience and he'll become Israel, which is to say that coming out of exile, Jacob will become Israel, even though historically the community that went into exile under the Babylonians was called Judah, or under the Persian control after the monarchy, Yehud, as a province of the Persian Empire. So we're going to have to look at what's going on there with the national elements of that. And this is the origin story here in Genesis 30 of the idea that the nation of Israel is the Bene Yisrael, the sons of Israel, the offspring of the eponymous founders of 12 so-called tribes. And as we'll note when we get to those chapters, that's a notion that plainly doesn't exist before the exile. And we'll look at the cultural and anthropological reasons when we get there. But at least one of which is that this area is probably too large for communication in the ancient world to have a sense of unity across that kind of space without some kind of imperial control like trade routes or military support or other things that gives people a common identity across a distance that they otherwise would not experience each other in. And I can note that in my own area, the Pacific Northwest of the United States, there's a general reference to the Salish people who speak similar languages, and yet up and down the coast of Washington State, which is larger than the nation of Israel as we know it now, but not that much larger. We could recognize that if you didn't have modern communication, that's a large area to consider as one people. So we'll look at how this story is presenting something. It's probably counterfactual, but presents a mythic origin over against other origin stories that existed before the Exodus. We also need to see how this section is shaped, and it's shaped with a whole series of interlocking chiasms. I note here that I've been providing keywords and other structures based on chapters here, but the chapters were created in the medieval era, and they're particularly unhelpful here, because plainly we start a whole new scene in 28:10, not in 28:1. So I'm going to focus here on 28:10 to 31:55, which is the end of 31. But this chiasm overall goes from 28:10 up to 31:18 for this unit. But then there's another chiasm for the next part of 31 that overlaps a wider chiasm to the end of 31. And so a whole series of interlocking things, and that is not accidental. Chiasm is there to help readers keep track of what's going on, but there's an obviously circular element to the whole business of going back to the old country, spending time there, and leaving, which is the very natural expression of a chiasm. And similarly, we'll see in these scenes with Rachel stealing her father's household gods, as they're often translated, teraphim, and the accusation when they catch later. So we'll see all the interlocking stories that involve escape and capture, symbolic of the exilic situation. Then we're also going to see, as I've been noting throughout this unit, that not only are they two nations in your womb, but they represent an argument over against the monarchy from an exilic standpoint. So this little chart here is one of many different versions, and different scholars see the connections with the David or the monarchy story different ways. But I'd like to highlight this chart that, again, we'll look at more when we get into the story, that Laban and his daughters is an allegory of the monarchy in exile. So just look at a few examples of this so we can see. And it's suggesting the whole idea of monarchy itself is foreign. And then Leah, the elder, is the mother of Judah, and Judah becomes the elder in relation to the nation of Israel. And we see the same thing with Rachel the younger and Israel the younger, called Ephraim, way later in 1 Kings, when the so-called united monarchy comes apart after Solomon. The common phrase of my bone and my flesh, which is rare outside of these places. The situation of a father-in-law being deceptive, the combination of 7 years, the Jacob slaving for Laban as Israel's slave for the Solomonic monarchy, and on we go. I won't go through every one of these, but I hope you can see, and especially with the unique situation of the teraphim, the so-called household gods, mentioned in Genesis only here, and in the monarchy story only there, that these stories are tightly connected. And as I'm going to suggest, the Genesis story is in many ways a counter story to the monarchy story, offering a post-exilic alternative to the hope for a new descendant of David who would restore the monarchy, which of course never happened and continued to be a hope at the time of Jesus, when the New Testament texts call Jesus son of David. Another theme that's related to the monarchy theme is Genesis' response to so-called Josiah's reform in roughly the 620s, after the Assyrians had taken over the northern kingdom of Israel, and Josiah tried to unite the remnant of Israel with Judah under a so-called reform that would bring everybody under the control of the Jerusalem temple. So as part of that, he tried to crush people and places that provided worship to Yahweh outside of Jerusalem, and one of those key ones was Bethel. So we can see, starting from that side, we can see in 2 Kings here the many different places where it's described in strong terms that King Josiah treated Bethel as an unsacred place, dropping ashes of pagan, or if you will, or non-Israelite shrines and gods, as well as the bodies of people who were worshiping in other places, even when they're worshiping Yahweh in other places. So a violent destruction campaign there to try to create so-called purity. And yet we're going to see in our passage here that Jacob, Mr. Israel himself, will find God was in this place and I didn't know it. And then later Yahweh will refer to him, or Elohim here in 31:13, I am the God of Bethel. So in great contrast to Josiah seeing Bethel as something that needed to be crushed, Genesis reaffirms that God is in Bethel, which means house of God. And so we'll look at that theme throughout as well. And thanks to the work of Spolstra, we can have this fascinating comparison of Jacob and his relationship with his women and the wife-sister stories we saw in Genesis 12, 20, and 26 with his father and his grandfather. And I've looked at those in common, and you can go back to my other videos and see those. But here the argument is there are all these elements in common, but there are all these inversions of the pattern. So we're going to have to look at what's going on there. Jacob doesn't go to some foreign potentate, as Abraham and Isaac did, and lie deliberately and say, the person you think is my wife is not my wife. Instead, he has the father of the women who become his wives, lying to him about it. And so we see some inversions of that pattern, and I'd like to suggest that has everything to do with Laban as an expression of Mesopotamia and Babylon and the deceiving situation that happens when you're in exile. And another aspect of this, as just part of the emigration element, as we'll see, as recent scholarship has very helpfully understood Jacob in terms of immigration studies, that he's a migrant, a refugee, and what does that mean, both in his relationship with settled people like Laban and the Mesopotamians, as well as for the Judahites who ended up in the actual exile in the 6th century BCE in Babylon, but also for the role of people of faith in relation to immigration now, which is, as we well know, a very difficult issue to negotiate, both in my location in the United States, but also throughout Europe and in many other places in the world. So we'll see if these stories help us understand God's perspective on that. And then finally, I'd like to look, especially from a feminist perspective, but one doesn't have to be a woman to read from a feminist perspective, despite the fact that I'm going to use the work of several women scholars to help us out here, the language of women's relationships to men in Genesis 29:31. I just want to highlight a couple of things that narrator overall. And again, we'll look at the details as we go. There are three terms at issue in the overall story of Genesis, or the larger picture of the Bible, but only two are in our section. One is Shifha, which I translate as maidservant, but I want to note that in our immediate section, using the new RSV as I've been following on the left side, the two women, Zilpah and Bilhah, are consistently referred to simply as maid, without servant, which sounds like they're just hired help, cleaning the dishes and taking care of the laundry. But note that in the Hagar story, back in chapter 16, the same word is translated as slave girl. And then later, at the end, after Jacob, described here as the man, has all his children, the narrator describes him as having many shifha in the plural, but they're translated here as female slaves, not as maid. But it's the same word. So I'm suggesting maid servant here, although we could have put female slaves as well. That's in contrast with Isha, which is traditionally translated as wife, but as I've noted many times throughout Genesis and my other texts I've been exploring here in Radical Bible, there is no Hebrew word for wife or husband. There's simply Ish for man and Isha for woman. And so I've translated here as woman that way, and then we reach an interesting paradox, which is to say that the two so-called maidservants are given as a woman or as a wife, and then it seems to be narratively taken back. When later in the story they're referred to as maidservants again, as we see up here, the same people. See, and this is in 30:18, whereas in 30 verse 4 and 39, each of them was described as a wife. So does Jacob have 4 wives, or does he have 2 wives and 2 maidservants, or whatever else you want to call them? But whatever you want to call them, they're not what some would call concubines, which is from a different word, pilagesh. And as recent scholarship has noted, the word concubine is unfairly and unjustly denigrating. The term really means secondary woman or secondary wife, in the sense of a commitment there. This is not just an object, but someone who doesn't have the same status as a primary woman, but is still considered a wife or a woman in that sense. And I note that none of the women in our immediate story is referred to that way. We see these examples earlier of Abraham's brother Nahor's secondary woman, and the description to the sons of his secondary women, although we only saw Keturah, who was described as an Isha. We hear Abraham gave gifts, so it's used in retrospect to talk about the children of this woman here, but it wasn't at the time. And then we'll see in 35, Reuben, one of the 12 children of these 4 women in our story, lay with Bilhah, one of the other 4, but not the one who's his mother, which would make it even worse than it already is. And then we see one other reference down here. But as my note here has, it's of the 37 times in the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text of what we call the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, 22 of those are in the Deuteronomistic history, which are the texts from Joshua through 2 Kings. So Joshua, Judges, 2 books of Samuel, and 2 books of Kings. And a whole collection of them in the horrible story of the rape of the Pilagesh here in Judges 19 to 20, which involves the people of Benjamin. And I looked at that in my series on Samuel around the story of Saul the Benjaminite. But it also comes up in 2 Samuel when 2 different people, first Abner, Saul's general, seeks to go into the dead Saul's Pilagesh to claim authority and is challenged by Saul's son, and then tries to go over to David before he gets killed. And then in Absalom's rebellion, when Absalom goes into his father's Pilagesh, multiple there, and we see that many times. And then it's referred to finally as Solomon had hundreds of them there. So it's clearly connected with a sense of monarchy here, and that's one reason it's not in our immediate passage, but we'll look at what that implies about the different relationships among these different men and women, and what the text is saying about the relationship between men and women as in terms of the relationship with each other, the relationship with their children, and the relationship with God, whether that's as Elohim or as Yahweh. So I hope this brief introduction allows us to hear some of the key issues that hold this unit together and provide us different angles of approach as we begin to enter into the beautiful, complex, and mysterious story of Jacob having a dream that God or God's angels were coming up and down out of the sky to him. We'll start with that next time. See you then. Bye-bye.